The International Summit Hall in Geneva was filled with the sound of cameras clicking and murmurs in multiple languages. Leaders from every continent had gathered under the pretense of cooperation, but the air was heavy with unspoken rivalries. At the center of attention stood Benjamin Netanyahu, his expression sharp, his tone heavy with certainty. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Africa is our next stop. It is inevitable. The wealth of your lands, the power hidden in your soil, it will be ours. Gasps echoed through the hall. Delegates from smaller nations exchanged nervous glances. The arrogance in his words was undeniable, carrying a promise of dominance dressed as strategy. For decades, Africa had been the target of foreign exploitation, its resources stripped, its people underestimated. Yet, on this day, the hall was not silent for long. Sitting calmly in his seat, dressed in his military uniform with the Burkinabe flag on his chest, Ibrahim Traoré slowly rose. His eyes fixed on Netanyahu with an intensity that made the room pause. Before the translators could catch up, his voice rang out in English, deliberate and firm, "Then let your next stop be your last. Africa does not wait for permission, and we bow to no threat." The room erupted, half in shock, half in applause. The silence that followed Traoré's words was tense, like the air before a storm. Netanyahu narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a faint smirk as if to dismiss the young African leader's defiance. He raised a hand to quiet the murmurs in the room, his voice dripping with authority. "History proves me right. Empires rise because weaker nations cannot resist them. Africa has always been taken, shaped, and ruled by powers greater than itself. You speak boldly, Captain Traoré, but words don't stop tanks, and pride doesn't stop armies." His supporters in the front row nodded firmly, believing his statement was untouchable truth. But Traoré did not flinch. He stood tall, his posture unshaken, his gaze locked on Netanyahu as if daring him to continue. Then he leaned slightly toward the microphone and spoke, each word like a drumbeat. "Empires fall because they forget the people. Africa is not weak, it is awakening. We do not need to outgun you, we only need to outlast you. And history proves us right, every chain breaks when the people rise." His voice carried conviction, the kind that was born not from rehearsed speeches but from lived struggle. The hall shifted. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed in, and whispers spread like wildfire. Delegates from other African nations straightened in their seats, emboldened by his response. For the first time, Netanyahu's composure seemed slightly rattled. His smirk tightened, but his silence said more than words. Traoré had struck a nerve, and the room knew it. Netanyahu's smirk returned, but this time it was thinner, edged with irritation. He leaned forward, gripping the podium with both hands, and his voice grew sharper, carrying across the chamber like a whip. "Do not mistake applause for strength, Captain. Your people may cheer, but cheers do not build missiles, and pride does not forge steel. Israel has survived because we are prepared to strike before we are struck. If Africa dares to challenge us, it will crumble beneath the weight of its own illusions." His words rang with the arrogance of power, a reminder that his nation had long been backed by wealth, allies, and weapons unmatched. The audience shifted uneasily. Some nodded at Netanyahu's confidence, others frowned at his blatant dismissal of Africa. The tension was palpable, a clash not just of leaders but of worlds, one carrying centuries of dominance, the other rising from generations of struggle. Traoré's eyes never wavered. He stepped closer to the microphone, his voice calm yet thunderous in its weight. "You mistake silence for fear. Africa does not need missiles to survive, we need unity. And unity is already here. You claim we will crumble, but it is your arrogance that crumbles empires. You look at Africa and see weakness, but I tell you this, we are not the past you conquered, we are the future you fear." The hall erupted in applause, louder than before. African delegates rose to their feet, clapping with pride. Even leaders from Asia and South America nodded, recognizing the moment for what it was, a challenge to the old order. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, but Traore had planted something far stronger than fear. He had planted doubt. The chamber grew heavier with each exchange, the air charged like a battlefield without weapons. Netanyahu adjusted his tie and leaned back, his voice cold, deliberate, almost venomous. You speak of unity as if it were a shield. But unity does not stop drones, and pride does not intercept planes. Africa may dream of freedom, but dreams cannot stop the march of reality. We decide the future because we have the power to enforce it. You, Captain Traore, are a young man shouting at giants. His words carried a sting meant to wound not only Traore, but the very spirit of the African nations listening. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably, while others, especially African representatives, sat rigid, their eyes burning with indignation. The arrogance of Netanyahu's dismissal felt like a knife twisting in old wounds of colonization, domination, and foreign control. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Traore leaned forward, his hand resting firmly on the podium, and his voice rose steady and unshakable. Do not mistake giants for immortals. Every empire that believed itself untouchable has fallen. You claim we are dreaming, but it is you who sleep, blind to the tide of change. Africa is not shouting, Africa is rising. And when the people rise, no drone, no plane, no army can hold them back. You do not own the future, you only fear it. The chamber erupted again, this time with thunderous applause that shook the hall itself. Cameras flashed, capturing Netanyahu's tightened jaw and Traore's unwavering defiance. It was no longer just a debate, it was a declaration. The hall was buzzing, but Netanyahu wasn't done. He leaned forward, his finger tapping the podium, voice sharpened like a blade. You claim Africa is rising, but tell me, where are your fleets, your satellites, your global banks? Words may ignite applause, but they do not build power. Power is measured by control, by dominance, by the ability to dictate terms. And on that scale, Africa is still at the mercy of nations like mine. You can roar all you want, Captain, but a roar without teeth is only noise. The words echoed, designed to humiliate and diminish. A few of Netanyahu's allies smirked, believing the blow had landed. Cameras swung to Traore, expecting hesitation, but what came next was fire. Traore's expression hardened, his jaw set like stone. His response cut through the chamber with the force of thunder. You mistake silence for weakness, and humility for chains. Africa's power does not sit in fleets or banks, it sits in its people, its land, its spirit. You speak of control, we speak of survival. And history has shown, those who survive, those who endure, they inherit the future. You measure dominance in weapons, we measure strength in generations. And believe me, the roar you dismiss will one day shake the very ground beneath your feet. The audience erupted, not with polite claps but with a standing ovation. Delegates rose from their seats, chants of solidarity rising from the African section. Netanyahu's smirk faltered, his attempt to belittle met with a wave of defiance that no bank balance or war machine could buy. Netanyahu inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the podium as if trying to anchor himself against the tide of cheers filling the hall. His tone grew colder, almost venomous. Your speeches might excite the crowd, Traore, but excitement fades. What then? Without alliances, without weapons, without capital, your so-called independence will collapse in silence. Africa's dreams will remain dreams. You will come back, crawling for aid, for loans, for the very hand you reject today. His words rang heavy with the arrogance of history, the echo of centuries where such prophecies often proved true. Some Western delegates nodded knowingly, as though they had already written Africa's fate in advance. Netanyahu's eyes scanned the room with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had reclaimed control. But Traore leaned into the microphone, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. You call it aid, we call it chains. You call it loans, we call it theft. You predict collapse, but it is not Africa that fears collapse, it is the empires who live on borrowed time. Look around you, do you not see it? The world is shifting. Your power is cracking, your grip loosens, and all you can do is threaten us with the same chains that already rust at your feet. If we crawl, it will not be toward you, it will be toward freedom. The room thundered. Reporters shouted over each other, their microphones thrust forward to catch every syllable. Delegates from Asia and Latin America joined the applause, their claps echoing solidarity. Netanyahu's words had intended to diminish, but instead, they exposed his desperation. And in that moment it was clear, Traore had flipped the balance of the room. The silence that followed was brief but sharp, like the snap of a branch before a storm. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice rising with anger. You speak of shifting worlds and broken chains, but you forget who builds the weapons, who writes the treaties, who controls the banks. You forget who decides which governments stand and which fall. Do not mistake the applause of sympathizers for true power, Traore. One order, one decision, and Africa will be isolated, cut off, left in darkness. His words were meant as thunder, loud enough to frighten, heavy enough to crush. The Western media immediately amplified his point, their pens scribbling lines of predicted downfall, framing Traore as reckless, out of depth. For a moment, it seemed like Netanyahu had regained momentum, using the sheer weight of history and resources to drown the voice of one African leader. But Traore did not flinch. He leaned closer to the microphone, his hands gripping the podium with a quiet firmness. His voice was lower now, but each word landed like a hammer. You call it power when you hold a gun to the world's head. But that is not power, that is fear disguised as authority. True power is not in controlling nations with threats, it is in a people rising who will not bow. You may write treaties, you may build weapons, but you cannot build submission where it no longer exists. Africa has seen your darkness before, and yet, here we stand, unbroken. If you cut us off, we will light our own torches. The room erupted again, not just in applause but in chants, delegates from smaller nations shouting, "Freedom," and "Africa rises." Netanyahu's expression tightened, his jaw clenched. He had aimed to intimidate, but instead, he had revealed the fragility of his authority. Traore's defiance was no longer just his own, it had become the rallying cry of every nation tired of being silenced. Netanyahu's patience was fraying. He slammed his hand against the table, his voice cutting through the hall. You dare defy the world order? You dare to spit in the face of nations that hold the keys to survival? We fed your economies, we paved your roads, we gave you aid when famine struck. And this is how you answer us? With arrogance? With rebellion? His words echoed, but the hall no longer trembled with his authority. Instead, it felt as though he was shouting into a storm he could not control. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the veins tightening along his neck, the frustration of a man used to commanding silence now drowned by dissent. Traore waited until the noise subsided, his calmness a direct contrast to Netanyahu's fury. He spoke slowly, deliberately. You did not feed us out of kindness. You fed us to keep us hungry for more. You paved our roads not to help us, but to direct us to your markets. Your aid was not generosity, it was a leash. But that leash has snapped. You mistake dignity for arrogance, freedom for rebellion. Africa does not rise against the world, Africa rises for itself. And we do not need your permission to stand. The reaction was electric. The delegates from Africa rose to their feet, pounding their desks in rhythm, their chants growing louder with each beat. Africa. 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 The sound reverberated across the hall, captured by every microphone, amplified by every camera. What was meant to be Netanyahu's show of dominance had become Traore's stage of defiance. Netanyahu's gaze hardened. He leaned back in his chair, his lips pursed into a thin line, knowing his threats had failed to silence. The old order had cracked before his eyes, and the man across from him, once dismissed as a young soldier out of his depth, had become the symbol of a continent's awakening. The chants of Africa. Africa, still echoed in the hall when Netanyahu leaned forward once more, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits. His voice, though quieter now, carried the weight of menace. Do you think defiance comes without consequence? Empires have risen and fallen on arrogance like yours. Africa may cheer you today, but tomorrow, when the engines of power grind against you, you will remember this moment as the one that doomed you. The words hung in the air like smoke, meant to suffocate. But Traore did not flinch. Instead, he rose to his feet, towering in his military uniform, his posture commanding the cameras as much as the delegates. He waited a heartbeat, then answered with a tone so steady it cut sharper than any shout, "Empires fall because they believe they cannot. Chains break because those who wear them decide they will. You think Africa fears the engines of your power? We have lived under your engines for centuries. We have carried their weight, felt their fire, and still we stand. If this is the moment you call doom, then remember, it is your world order that is trembling, not us." The hall erupted again, this time not just with chants but with claps, roars, and a rising energy that spilled beyond the room. Journalists scrambled to relay the words, typing furiously as headlines began to take shape. Traore defies Netanyahu at Global Summit. Africa's voice thunders across the world stage. For the first time, Netanyahu glanced around and saw not allies nodding, but leaders shifting uncomfortably, some even applauding softly. The iron unity he had counted on was fracturing before his eyes. His threats, once weapons, were now boomerangs, turning the spotlight into Traore's victory. And as the camera zoomed in, the image that would circle the world was sealed, Netanyahu scowling, his fist clenched in silent frustration, while Traore stood tall, unshaken, embodying a defiance that felt larger than any one man. The summit's moderator finally tried to bring the session to a close, his gavel tapping lightly against the wooden desk, but the tension in the air refused to break. Cameras from every major network zoomed in, knowing they had just captured history. Netanyahu, still stiff in his chair, whispered to his aides, his voice drowned by the cheers of African delegates. His threats had been loud, but his silence now screamed even louder. Traore took one final step toward the microphone. His voice, calm yet thunderous, filled the chamber. Let this day be remembered. Not as the day Netanyahu threatened Africa, but as the day Africa answered back. We are not colonies. We are not pawns. We are the heartbeat of this earth, and our destiny is ours alone. If anyone doubts this, look around this room. The applause you hear is not for me, it is for Africa's freedom. The hall thundered as delegates rose to their feet, clapping and chanting. Even leaders who had been hesitant moments before now stood shoulder to shoulder with the African bloc. The applause rolled like a wave, swallowing the last of Netanyahu's words in a tide of unity. Outside the summit, thousands gathered to watch the live broadcast erupted into cheers. Across Africa, televisions flickered with the same scene, their leader standing tall, unbowed, and unapologetic. Headlines were already forming. Traore breaks the silence of centuries. Netanyahu's threats collapse under Africa's defiance. And as Traore left the podium, his uniform gleaming under the lights, he did not smile in triumph. Instead, he carried the expression of a man who knew the struggle was not over, but who also knew the tide had turned. For the first time in generations, Africa had spoken on its own terms, and the world had been forced to listen. O day we witnessed more than just words exchanged on a stage. We saw Africa standing tall, refusing to bend, refusing to break. Netanyahu's threats were loud, but Traore's response was louder, not with anger, but with truth. This is not just one man's defiance. This is the voice of a continent reclaiming its dignity, its freedom, and its future. Remember this moment, because history will. Africa bows to no one. And from this day forward, the world will never forget it.